The strange thing wasn't that the boy came into my bakery alone every Saturday morning. It was that he always bought 2 cookies, even though I never once saw him eat the second one. By the 17th Saturday, I could recognize Oliver Morgan before the bell above the door even finished ringing. He arrived at 9:07 almost exactly, wearing sneakers that squeaked against the old hardwood floor and carrying a small canvas backpack that looked slightly too big for his narrow shoulders. Everyone else called him Oliver. Somewhere around week 4, he quietly informed me that people he liked were allowed to call him Ollie. I considered that one of the highest honors Maple and Rye had ever received. "Morning, Noah," he said, climbing onto his usual stool beside the pastry case. "Morning, troublemaker." I slid a small paper bag across the counter. "Let me guess. 1 cinnamon roll and 2 chocolate chip cookies." Ollie narrowed his blue eyes at me with exaggerated suspicion. "How did you know?" "Professional baker's intuition. You say that every week." "And every week, I'm right." That earned me the tiny smile I'd been waiting for. Saturday mornings were usually the busiest hours at Maple and Rye. The espresso machine hissed behind me. Ceramic mugs clicked against saucers. The whole room smelled like dark coffee, brown butter, cinnamon, and bread cooling on wire racks. Sunlight poured through the front windows and painted warm rectangles across the floor. I had opened the bakery 3 years earlier because I wanted a place that felt less like a business and more like somewhere people could exhale. Somehow, Ollie had figured that out before most adults did. I placed his cinnamon roll on a plate, still warm enough for the icing to soften around the edges. Then came the cookies. He ate the first slowly, breaking off careful pieces between bites of cinnamon roll. The second cookie remained untouched. It always did. When he finished, he slipped it into the paper bag, folded the top twice, and tucked it carefully into his backpack as though it were something fragile. I'd noticed the ritual the first Saturday. By the 5th, I was curious. By the 10th, I had invented half a dozen explanations. Maybe he had a sibling. Maybe a friend lived nearby. Maybe he saved it for later. But 17 Saturdays can make curiosity feel almost personal. "Okay," I finally said, wiping flour from my hands onto my apron. "I have to ask." Ollie looked up. "Ask what?" I nodded toward the backpack. "The second cookie. You never eat it." His fingers stopped on the zipper. "It's not for me." I figured. I smiled. "Brother? Sister?" He shook his head. "Dad." Something about the answer surprised me. "Your dad likes chocolate chip?" "He says he doesn't." Ollie leaned closer, as if sharing classified information. "But he always eats it." I laughed softly. "Then I think your dad likes chocolate chip." Ollie considered this with the seriousness only a 7-year-old could give a cookie-related mystery. "Maybe." I reached for a clean tray, but another question slipped out before I could stop it. "How come he never comes inside with you?" Ollie's expression changed. Not dramatically. That was what made me notice. His smile simply disappeared, and his eyes moved toward the front window. I followed his gaze. Outside, cars rolled slowly along the narrow downtown street. A marked crosswalk connected our block to the parking spaces on the other side, directly in front of the bakery. "Dad waits," he said. "Outside." Ollie nodded. I suddenly felt as though I'd stepped too close to something private. "You don't have to tell me why." "It's okay." He traced one finger along the edge of his plate. "He doesn't like places that remind him of Mom." The sounds of the bakery seemed to soften around me. I looked at Ollie, at the backpack holding that carefully wrapped second cookie, and finally understood that his Saturday ritual wasn't really about pastries. "Did your mom like bakeries?" I asked gently. Ollie looked toward the pastry case, but his eyes seemed fixed on someplace much farther away. "She liked this one." My hand went still. I had owned Maple and Rye for 3 years, and suddenly I wondered whether I had once served a woman whose name I'd never learned, never knowing that her little boy would someday become part of my Saturdays. Ollie slid down from the stool and pulled on his backpack. "See you next week, Noah. I'll have your cinnamon roll ready." He smiled again and headed for the door. The bell chimed as he stepped outside. For reasons I couldn't explain, I moved closer to the window. Ollie walked to the marked crosswalk, checked both directions the way a kid who'd been reminded 1,000 times would, then hurried across the quiet street toward a black SUV parked beneath a maple tree. Through the windshield, I could just make out the silhouette of a man sitting behind the wheel. Ollie climbed into the passenger side and immediately reached into his backpack. A moment later, he held up the little paper bag containing the second cookie. The man turned toward him. Even from across the street, I could see Ollie talking excitedly with his hands. Then the man looked up, straight toward Maple Rye, straight toward me. For one suspended second, our eyes met through 2 panes of glass and 30 feet of pavement. Then he looked away. For the rest of that Saturday, I told myself the moment across the street meant nothing. But I kept seeing the stranger's face whenever the bell above the bakery door rang. I had only caught a brief glimpse of him through the windshield, yet there had been something unmistakable in the way he looked at Maple and Rye. It wasn't curiosity. It was recognition, mixed with the kind of hesitation people carried when a place held memories they weren't ready to touch. The following Saturday, Ollie arrived at exactly 9:07, just as usual. He wore a navy sweatshirt, his canvas backpack, and the serious expression of someone arriving for an important appointment. "Your usual is ready," I said. His face brightened. "Even the cookies?" "Especially the cookies." I handed him the familiar paper bag and glanced through the front window before I could stop myself. The black SUV was there again, parked across the street beneath the maple tree. "Looking for somebody?" Ollie asked. "Just checking the weather." He turned toward the window. Bright sunshine covered the sidewalk. "There are no clouds. Bakers are terrible meteorologists." Ollie laughed and climbed onto his stool. I tried to focus on work, but now that I knew who was waiting outside, the vehicle felt impossible to ignore. While Ollie ate his cinnamon roll, I occasionally caught the outline of his father behind the windshield. He never stepped out. The next Saturday was the same. Then the next. Ollie came inside while his father remained across the street. It became another part of the ritual, as predictable as the smell of cinnamon at 9 in the morning. Meanwhile, Ollie began staying longer. When the rush slowed, I showed him how to pipe frosting onto cupcakes. His first attempt looked like a lopsided snowman. "It's supposed to be a rose," he protested. "Of course it is. You thought it was a snowman. I would never insult an artist." He gave me a suspicious look before bursting into laughter. I found myself laughing too. There was something easy about being around him. Ollie asked questions adults had forgotten how to ask. Why did bread need to rest? Why did vanilla smell better than it tasted by itself? Why did grown-ups drink coffee when most of them immediately added things to make it taste less like coffee? I answered what I could and invented ridiculous explanations for the rest. Eventually, though, our conversations always seemed to circle back to his father. "Dad makes pancakes on Sundays," Ollie told me one morning. "Are they good?" "They're shaped weird." That wasn't my question. Ollie lowered his voice. "They're not very good." I smiled. "Don't tell him I said that. Your secret is safe." He nodded solemnly, then added, "Mom used to make them." There it was again. That small opening into a story Ollie never seemed afraid to mention, even if his father couldn't walk through the door connected to it. I set a fresh cookie on the cooling rack. "You said your mom liked this bakery." Ollie nodded. "She brought me here when I was little. I might have met her." He considered that. Her name was Claire. The name stirred something faint in my memory, but 3 years of customers had created thousands of faces. "She liked cinnamon rolls too," Ollie continued. "She said this place smelled happy." My throat tightened unexpectedly. That might be the nicest review I've ever gotten. Ollie smiled, but then his gaze drifted toward the window. "Dad still drives me because he promised I could keep coming." "That sounds like a good dad." "He is." Ollie paused. "He just can't come inside." I didn't ask why. This time I waited. Ollie looked down at his hands. "Mom got sick a long time ago. She died 3 years ago." His voice remained steady, but quieter. "After that, Dad stopped going to places they went together." I glanced across the street. The black SUV sat in the same spot. Suddenly, it no longer looked like a vehicle waiting at the curb. It looked like a boundary. Caleb Morgan could drive his son all the way here every Saturday. But the final 30 feet might as well have been 30 miles. "Sometimes Dad watches through the window," Ollie said. "He thinks I don't notice." I looked at him. Maybe watching is the closest he can get right now. Ollie seemed to think about that before carefully folding the top of the paper bag containing his father's cookie. Then he hopped down from the stool. "See you next Saturday, Noah." 9-7. 9-7. I watched him use the crosswalk and climb into the SUV. He handed Caleb the bag. This time, Caleb didn't immediately drive away. He looked toward the bakery again, and I resisted the instinct to pretend I hadn't noticed. I simply lifted one hand in a small wave. Caleb stared at me for a second. His hand moved slightly from the steering wheel, almost returning the gesture. Almost. Then the SUV pulled away, leaving me with the strange feeling that a conversation had already begun between us, even though neither of us had spoken a single word. The next Saturday, 9:07 came and went without Ollie. At first, I barely noticed. Maple and Rye was packed with the usual weekend crowd, and I was moving between the espresso machine and pastry case while trying to keep 3 trays of croissants from disappearing at once. But at 9:15, I looked toward the door. At 9:30, I checked the street. The space beneath the maple tree was empty. No black SUV. No boy with a canvas backpack. No second cookie waiting to be wrapped. I told myself children had soccer games, birthday parties, family plans, and 100 other reasons to miss a bakery visit. Still, when I closed that afternoon, I caught myself staring at the untouched chocolate chip cookie I had automatically set aside. The following Saturday, I prepared his order again. 9:07. Nothing. 9:20. Nothing. By 10, I had stopped pretending I wasn't worried. The morning passed. Customers came and went. Every time the bell rang, some hopeful part of me expected Ollie to appear with his serious little expression and an explanation for being late. He never did. That evening, rain swept through town, turning the windows into shimmering sheets of reflected streetlights. By 6, the bakery was empty. I cleaned the counters, covered the remaining pastries, shut down the espresso machine, and turned the sign on the front door from open to closed. I was reaching for my coat when someone knocked on the glass. I looked up and froze. The man standing outside was familiar even though I had never seen him this clearly. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark brown hair damp from the rain and tired blue eyes that looked exactly like Ollie's when he was thinking too hard. Caleb Morgan. He stood beneath the narrow awning holding a worn Maple and Rye paper bag in one hand. I unlocked the door immediately. Caleb. His expression shifted with surprise. You know who I am. Ollie talks about you. For the first time, I saw something soften behind the exhaustion in his face. Then it disappeared. I'm sorry to show up after closing. Is Ollie okay? The question came out faster than I intended. Caleb looked at me carefully, as if the concern itself had caught him off guard. He's fine. He caught a nasty respiratory bug last week and ran a fever for a few days. His doctor wanted him home until he'd fully recovered. He's doing much better now. Relief moved through me so quickly that I laughed under my breath. Good. I was starting to imagine every possible explanation. Caleb glanced toward the bakery interior, but remained outside. Warm light spilled across the wet sidewalk between us. He was worried about that. About what? You worrying. Caleb looked down at the old paper bag in his hand. Its edges had been folded and unfolded so many times they'd gone soft. He kept saying I needed to come tell you because you'd have his cinnamon roll ready. I smiled. I did. Twice. Caleb gave a quiet laugh, so brief I almost missed it. That sounds like him. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Rain tapped against the awning while the smell of coffee and baked bread drifted through the open doorway. I stepped aside. You can come in if you want. It's warmer. Caleb's eyes moved past me toward the counter, the tables, and finally the booth beside the front window where Ollie usually sat. His entire posture changed. His shoulders tightened, and his fingers closed around the paper bag. I remembered what Ollie had told me. You don't have to, I said. Caleb looked grateful that I'd given him a way out. Claire loved this place. Hearing her name from him felt different. Ollie told me. Caleb nodded. She found it not long after you opened. Every Saturday, she brought him here. Even when she got sick, she tried to keep doing it as long as she could. He stared at the doorway as though 3 years of memories stood just beyond it. The last promise I made her was that I'd keep bringing him. I finally understood the black SUV, the waiting, the cookie carried across the street every week. Caleb hadn't been avoiding his son's memories. He'd been protecting them while carrying his own from 30 feet away. You kept the promise, I said. I drove him here. Caleb's voice lowered. That's not the same thing. Maybe not. But you still got him to the door every Saturday. His eyes met mine. Something in his expression loosened. I didn't ask him to come inside again. Instead, I walked behind the counter, placed 1 cinnamon roll and 2 chocolate chip cookies into a fresh bag, and returned to the doorway. For Ollie. Caleb reached for his wallet. No. I handed him the bag. This one's overdue. He looked at it, then at me. Thank you, Noah. It was the first time I'd heard him say my name. Caleb turned toward the rain, took 2 steps, then stopped. He looked back at the warm bakery behind me. For one uncertain second, I thought he might finally cross the threshold. He didn't. But before walking away, he said quietly, "He'll be here next Saturday." And somehow, the word he made me notice wasn't he. It was here. At 9:06 the following Saturday, I looked through the front window and saw the black SUV pull into its usual spot beneath the maple tree. 1 minute later, the bakery door opened, and Ollie walked in wearing his canvas backpack and a green jacket zipped all the way to his chin. 9:07, he announced proudly. "You're officially more punctual than my bread timer." His face looked a little pale, but the energy had returned to his eyes. I placed his cinnamon roll on the counter. "How are you feeling?" "Better. Dad made me have a lot of soup." "Good soup." Ollie made a face. "His soup is mostly water." I tried not to laugh. "Don't let him hear you say that." Ollie climbed onto his stool and pointed toward the pastry case. 2 cookies. Already packed. I reached beneath the counter for the familiar paper bag, but Ollie didn't take it. Instead, he looked through the window. Dad should come get his own. My hand stopped. Across the street, Caleb sat behind the wheel exactly where he'd been every Saturday before. "Maybe give him time," I said. Ollie sighed with the weary patience of a child who believed adults made simple things unnecessarily complicated. Then he ate his cinnamon roll and told me everything I'd missed during his absence, including a school science project, a neighbor's new puppy, and the terrible vegetable soup Caleb apparently considered medicine. Nearly 20 minutes later, the bell above the door rang. I looked up automatically. Caleb stood just inside the entrance. For a moment, nobody moved. His dark brown hair was neatly combed this time, and he wore jeans, a charcoal sweater, and the cautious expression of someone who had crossed an invisible line. Ollie smiled so widely that I immediately understood this hadn't been part of Caleb's plan. "Dad," Caleb glanced at his son. "You forgot your water bottle." Ollie pointed toward the bottle beside his plate. "No, I didn't." Caleb stared at it. Ollie took another bite of cinnamon roll. I suddenly became very interested in arranging coffee cups. "Since you're already inside," Ollie said, "you can sit down." "Oliver, Noah has coffee." Caleb looked at me. "Does Noah?" "Noah has an unreasonable amount of coffee." A reluctant smile appeared on Caleb's face. "Black." I remember. His eyebrows lifted. Ollie told me. That wasn't entirely true. Ollie had mentioned it once, weeks earlier, and somehow I'd remembered. I poured the coffee and placed it on the table nearest the door, leaving Caleb plenty of space. He sat carefully, as though the chair belonged to somebody else. His gaze traveled around the bakery and eventually settled on the booth beside the window. "That was her table," he said quietly. Ollie stopped eating. I stayed behind the counter. "Claire always chose that booth," Caleb continued. "She liked watching people walk past outside." He gave a faint smile. "She invented stories about them, where they were going, what they did for work, whether they were secretly famous." Ollie brightened. "She told me the mailman was a spy." Caleb laughed, and the sound changed his whole face. For the first time, I could imagine the man he might have been before grief reorganized his life. "She told you everyone was a spy." The laughter faded naturally, leaving something softer behind instead of silence. Caleb looked down at his coffee. "After she died, I couldn't come back in here. I tried once. I made it as far as the sidewalk." "You don't owe this place anything," I said. His eyes lifted to mine. "Maybe not, but Ollie loves it. Then let him love it. You don't have to experience it the same way he does." Caleb seemed surprised. "Most people tell me I need to move forward. People say things when they want grief to have a schedule." His fingers tightened slightly around the mug. "You sound like you know something about it." "I know people are allowed to miss someone without turning it into a problem that needs fixing." Caleb held my gaze for several seconds. There was no dramatic change, only a quiet easing in his shoulders. Then Ollie pushed the second chocolate chip cookie across the table toward him. "You can eat it here today." Caleb looked at the cookie. "I thought this was for later." "Not anymore." Caleb picked it up and took a bite. Ollie immediately looked at me with an expression of triumph. "See? He likes them." "Apparently I do," Caleb admitted. 40 minutes passed before he noticed the time. He had planned to deliver a water bottle and leave. Instead, his coffee cup was empty, half the cookie was gone, and Ollie was teaching him how to identify pastries through the glass case. When they finally stood to leave, Caleb paused at the door. "Thank you for not making today a big deal." "What happened today?" I asked. His smile returned, small but genuine. "Exactly." The door closed behind them. Through the window, I watched father and son use the crosswalk together. Something had changed. Caleb had spent months waiting 30 feet away from Maple and Rye. That morning, he'd finally walked those 30 feet. And when the next Saturday came, I found myself wondering whether he'd need an excuse to do it again. He didn't. The next Saturday, Caleb came through the door at 9:08 without a water bottle, an excuse, or even the uncertain pause I'd started to expect. Ollie followed one step behind him with a smile that told me he'd noticed too. "You're late," I said. Caleb glanced at the clock above the pastry case. "By 1 minute. Standards are standards. Should we leave and try again?" "Absolutely not. I already poured your coffee." He looked at the black coffee waiting beside Ollie's cinnamon roll, and something warm passed across his face. You remembered. Professional baker's intuition. Ollie climbed onto his stool. That's what he says when he doesn't want to explain things. Caleb laughed. I decided I liked the sound more than I should have. One Saturday became 2, then 3. Without any of us announcing it, Caleb stopped waiting in the SUV. He still parked beneath the maple tree, but now he crossed the street with Ollie. They took the booth beside the window. Ollie ate his cinnamon roll. Caleb drank black coffee and pretended the second chocolate chip cookie wasn't specifically his. Our conversations began with harmless things. Weather, school, the ridiculous price of butter. Then they stretched into stories. Caleb worked as an architect for a small firm downtown, which explained why he studied every crooked shelf in my bakery as if personally offended by it. One morning, he stared at the wooden shelf behind the register for so long that I finally asked, "Is something wrong?" "It leans. It has character. It's leaning 2 inches to the left." Character leans. The following Saturday, Caleb arrived carrying a toolbox. "No," I said immediately. "I haven't said anything yet. You brought tools into my bakery. Your shelf is asking for help." 20 minutes later, he stood on a small step stool tightening a bracket while Ollie supervised from below and offered advice nobody had requested. I handed Caleb a screwdriver. Our fingers brushed for barely a second, but he went strangely still. "So did I?" Then Ollie announced, "It's still crooked." Whatever had passed between us disappeared beneath Caleb's offended response. "It's absolutely level." Maple and Rye began collecting moments like that. Small ones. Ordinary ones. Caleb holding the door for me when my arms were full of flour sacks. Me slipping an extra blueberry muffin into Ollie's backpack for Monday morning. Caleb staying after the rush to help stack chairs even when I told him customers weren't supposed to work. One rainy Saturday, Ollie fell asleep in the window booth after spending an hour decorating cupcakes. His head rested against Caleb's arm, while blue frosting stained one corner of his mouth. "He fought sleep all morning," Caleb whispered. "He told me Saturdays are too important to waste sleeping." I smiled and lowered my voice. "That sounds serious." Caleb looked at his son, and the tenderness in his expression made something inside my chest tighten. "He looks like Claire when he sleeps." I waited, expecting the familiar shadow to cross his face. It did, but this time, it didn't close him off. "She would have liked you," he said. "I wasn't prepared for that." "You think so?" "She liked people who made ordinary places feel important." His eyes moved around the bakery. "She was right about this place." Before I could answer, a timer sounded from the kitchen. I hurried back and discovered that the commercial mixer had stopped halfway through a batch of brioche dough. "That doesn't sound good," Caleb said from behind me. "You're supposed to be sitting with your coffee, and you're staring at that machine like it personally betrayed you." I shut off the mixer and unplugged it. Caleb crouched beside me, but kept his hands away from the electrical housing. "Architect," I reminded him, "not appliance technician. Believe me, I'm not volunteering to rewire your commercial equipment." "Good. I enjoy having insurance." He smiled and pointed toward the bowl lift assembly. "The bowl isn't seated evenly. Check the latch." I crouched beside him while he held the flashlight. The latch had slipped out of position, probably when I'd rushed the last batch. I reset it, checked the guard, and plugged the mixer back in. It started normally. Caleb looked far too pleased with himself. "You didn't fix anything," I said. "I provided expert illumination." "Heroic." "You're welcome." He looked up at me, smiling. There was flour on his cheek. Without thinking, I reached over and brushed it away with my thumb. The smile vanished. Not because he was angry, because suddenly neither of us was laughing. We were close enough that I could see the tiny flecks of gray in his blue eyes. Caleb looked at my hand, then back at me. For one quiet second, The bakery seemed to shrink around us. Then Ollie stirred in the booth. Caleb stood quickly. I should get him home. His voice had changed. Of course. He packed the toolbox while I pretended to check the mixer. A few minutes later, Ollie woke and sleepily pulled on his backpack. At the door, he hugged me around the waist, something he'd started doing without asking. See you next Saturday, Noah. I'll be here. Caleb's hand rested on the door, but he didn't look at me. Thanks for the coffee. Anytime. They stepped outside. Through the window, I watched them reach the SUV. Ollie climbed in, but Caleb remained beside the driver's door for several seconds, staring back at Maple and Rye. Then he looked away. I understood the fear in his face before I understood my own. Caleb had finally learned how to walk through that door without Claire beside him. Now something new was waiting inside, and I was beginning to wonder whether that frightened him. Even more, the Saturday after I brushed flour from Caleb's cheek, the black SUV never appeared beneath the maple tree. At 9:07, I looked toward the door. At 9:15, I told myself Ollie was running late. By 9:30, I stopped pretending I wasn't watching the street. I'd still prepared the usual order. 1 cinnamon roll sat beneath the glass warmer, and 2 chocolate chip cookies waited inside a paper bag behind the register. By noon, the cinnamon roll was gone to another customer. But I kept the cookies. I couldn't explain why. The following Saturday was exactly the same. No Ollie. No Caleb. No message. The booth beside the window stayed empty, and suddenly I understood how quickly people could become part of the shape of a place. I missed Ollie's questions. I missed Caleb quietly correcting everything I said about architecture. I even missed seeing his black coffee cooling because he always forgot to drink it while listening to his son talk. On the 3rd Saturday, I stopped preparing their order in advance. That hurt more than it should have. I had Caleb's number somewhere in the bakery records because he'd once placed a birthday cake order for Ollie's school, but I never used it. Whatever had frightened him belonged to him. Chasing him would only turn the bakery into another place demanding something from him. So I waited. For weeks passed. Then, on a Wednesday afternoon, the bell above the door rang during the quiet hour between lunch and the after-school crowd. I looked up and saw Ollie. Beside him stood an older woman with silver blonde hair and the same gentle blue eyes Ollie had inherited from Claire. Ollie ran toward me before I could say his name and wrapped both arms around my waist. You disappeared, I said softly. Dad did, he corrected. The woman approached with an apologetic smile. I'm Margaret, Claire's mother. Noah. I know. Something about the way she said it made me glance at Ollie. He was already climbing onto his usual stool. Margaret placed a small cardboard box on the counter. Caleb doesn't know I brought this. My stomach tightened. Is he okay? Margaret considered the question. He's functioning. That wasn't exactly an answer. Her hand remained on the box. I wasn't sure whether I should bring this. But Ollie thought you should see it. Ollie turned around. Show him, Grandma. Margaret pushed the box toward me. I lifted the lid. Inside were folded brown paper bags from Maple and Rye. I recognized my own logo stamped across each one. Some were wrinkled. Some had grease marks. Others had been carefully flattened. I pulled one out, then another. Why does Caleb have these? Ollie answered before Margaret could. Those are my Saturday cookie bags. I stared at the box. Then I understood. These weren't bags from all the Saturdays that had followed. They were the bags from those first 17 Saturdays, when Ollie had come inside alone and Caleb had waited across the street. I counted them anyway. 17. Exactly 17. He kept every one. Dad keeps things when they matter, Ollie said. Margaret didn't explain. She didn't need to. Ollie reached into the box and pulled out a newer bag. This one's from the day Dad came inside. On the folded edge, someone had written a date in neat handwriting. Caleb's handwriting. Beneath it were 4 words. Good day. Stayed 40 minutes. My chest tightened. Margaret looked away, giving me privacy I hadn't asked for, but suddenly needed. For a moment, none of us spoke. Then she said quietly, he hasn't been back here because being here started to mean something different to him. I looked at her. She gave a small shake of her head. The rest is Caleb's to tell you, if he chooses to. That was all. No explanation of what he felt. No attempt to translate his grief for him. Just 17 old paper bags and 4 handwritten words. Ollie looked at me with unusual seriousness. Dad misses you. I crouched so we were eye level. Did he tell you that? Ollie shook his head. He doesn't have to. I smiled faintly. Sometimes grown-ups still need to say things for themselves. I know. He paused. They're slow. That made Margaret laugh. It made me laugh too. But after they left, I sat alone in the window booth with the box beside me. For weeks, I'd believed Caleb's absence meant I'd imagined whatever was growing between us. The box didn't tell me exactly what Caleb felt. It wasn't permission to decide for him. But those 17 paper bags told me one thing I hadn't understood before. Long before Caleb and I shared coffee, long before our hands touched beside a stubborn mixer, I had already been entering his life through the stories his son carried home every Saturday. Maybe Caleb hadn't disappeared because nothing had happened between us. Maybe he'd disappeared because something had. I still didn't call him. For 3 days, his number sat on a bakery order form inside the register drawer, close enough that I could have reached it in seconds. Every time I considered it, I stopped. Margaret had been right about one thing. The rest was Caleb's to tell. I didn't want to become another person telling him how grief was supposed to work. So I did the only thing that felt right. On Friday night, after the last customer left, I baked a fresh batch of chocolate chip cookies. I chose one while it was still warm, slipped it into a maple and rye bag, and wrote a message on the outside. You don't have to erase one love to make room for another. Nothing else. No question. No request. No expectation. Margaret picked it up the next morning before opening, promising only that she'd leave it with Caleb. Then Saturday arrived. At 9:07, the space beneath the maple tree was empty. I'd expected that. Expectation didn't make the silence easier. At 9:20, I served coffee to a couple from down the street. At 9:45, I pulled blueberry muffins from the oven. At 10:30, I stopped looking through the window. The day continued because days always do, even when some part of you is waiting for a door to open. Caleb didn't come. Neither did Ollie. Another week passed. Then another. I began to wonder whether the note had been a mistake. Not because the words were untrue, but because even gentle words could feel like pressure when someone was afraid. I returned the box of 17 paper bags to Margaret through Ollie. I kept nothing. They belonged to Caleb. Pieces of a journey he'd been making long before I understood I was part of it. By the 4th week, I'd settled into a quieter kind of acceptance. I missed them, but I stopped building Saturday mornings around their absence. Then, late one Thursday evening, I was alone at Maple and Rye finishing the next morning's bread when the bell above the door rang. I'd forgotten to lock it. We're closed, I called from the kitchen. No answer came. I wiped my hands on my apron and stepped into the front room. Caleb stood just inside the door. He was alone. No Ollie. No forgotten water bottle. No toolbox. No excuse. He held the small paper bag I'd sent him nearly a month earlier. Hi, he said. One simple word. Somehow, it carried every Saturday he'd missed. Hi. He glanced toward the window booth. Can I sit down? You never have to ask. I made coffee without asking what he wanted. Black. He watched me place the mug in front of him, then turned the paper bag slowly between his hands. I ate the cookie. I hoped you would. 3 weeks after you sent it. That seems excessive, even for one of my cookies. A faint smile appeared. I kept reading the message. I sat across from him. Caleb stared into his coffee. The first time I laughed in this bakery, I went home and cried. I said nothing. The first time I realized I was looking forward to seeing you, I felt ashamed. He swallowed. Then that day in the kitchen, when you touched my face, I went home and took Claire's photograph off my nightstand. His voice tightened. I put it back 10 minutes later because I hated myself for moving it. Caleb, I know it doesn't make sense. It makes sense to you. That's enough. He looked at me then, his blue eyes tired but clear. That's what scares me about you. That I make sense. That you never ask me to pretend I'm fine. The bakery was completely still around us. The ovens held their fading warmth, and the room smelled faintly of bread, coffee, and cinnamon. Caleb unfolded the paper bag and flattened it carefully on the table between us. My message faced upward. I love Claire, he said. I still love her. I know. And I think part of me believed that was supposed to be the end of the story. He looked down at the bag. I got one great love. We built a family. I lost her. After that, my job was to raise Ollie and be grateful for what I had. He paused. Then he started coming home talking about you. I smiled slightly. Apparently, I make funny-looking muffins. He talked about those for 2 weeks. Caleb laughed softly. Then his expression became serious again. Eventually, I started watching for you through the window. I didn't move. I knew when you opened. I knew you always gave Ollie the bigger cinnamon roll. I knew you cleaned the front tables yourself when the morning rush ended. His eyes met mine. I knew all of that before you even knew my name. The confession left me silent. Caleb reached across the table, stopping his hand halfway between us. He didn't take mine. He simply left the choice there. I placed my hand over his. His fingers closed gently around mine. I thought loving you would mean leaving her behind, he whispered. I held his gaze. Maybe moving forward isn't the same as leaving someone behind. Caleb's eyes filled, but this time he didn't look away. He sat there holding my hand in the bakery Claire had once loved, surrounded by memories that had finally stopped feeling like locked doors. And for the first time since I'd known him, Caleb wasn't standing outside his own future. For a while, neither of us moved. Caleb's hand stayed beneath mine on the table, warm and steady now, while the bakery settled into the quiet sounds it made after closing. The refrigerator hummed behind the counter. Rain tapped softly against the front windows. Somewhere in the kitchen, the old wall clock marked another minute passing. But for once, Caleb didn't seem interested in measuring how long he'd been inside. There's something else, he said finally. I waited. He glanced toward the booth where Ollie usually sat. When Claire was sick, everyone wanted me to be strong. For her. For Ollie. His thumb moved slowly against the side of my hand. After she died, everyone still wanted me to be strong. People brought casseroles, offered condolences, told me I was doing an amazing job raising him. He looked down. They meant well. But eventually being strong became the only thing I knew how to be. That sounds exhausting. It was easier than admitting I was lonely. His honesty landed quietly between us. I squeezed his hand. You're allowed to be lonely. I know that now. Caleb looked directly at me. I'm also allowed to stop being lonely. My heartbeat stumbled. I tried to answer, but he continued before I could. I don't know what this is supposed to look like, Noah. I haven't dated anyone since Claire. I haven't wanted to. He exhaled. I don't know how to explain any of this to people, and I definitely don't know how to explain it to myself. Then don't explain it yet. His brow furrowed. What do we do instead? Have coffee. He looked at the empty mug. It's almost 8 at night. Decaf. That feels dishonest. I laughed. After a second, Caleb did too. The tension loosened just enough for us to breathe again. I stood and walked behind the counter. Tea. That sounds safer. I made 2 mugs and brought them to the window booth. Caleb hesitated when he realized where I'd chosen to sit. Claire's table. We can sit somewhere else, I said. He looked at the booth for a long moment. Then he shook his head. No, I think I want to sit here. We sat across from each other while rain traced silver lines down the glass. Caleb told me about Claire without the careful sadness he usually carried around her name. He told me she hated folding laundry, loved old mystery novels, and once drove 40 miles because she'd heard about a diner that supposedly served the best apple pie in the state. Was it? I asked. Not even close. I'm offended on behalf of pie. Claire was too. She complained about it for 6 months. He smiled at the memory. This time, the smile stayed. That mattered more than anything I could have said. Loving Claire wasn't pulling him away from me. It was simply part of who he was. After nearly an hour, Caleb looked around and seemed surprised by how late it had become. Ollie's staying with Margaret tonight, he said. She told me I wasn't allowed to pick him up early. I like her. She likes you too much. That sounds like a personal problem. Caleb laughed again. Then the laughter faded, and his expression became serious. I came here tonight because I didn't want Ollie to be the reason. The reason for what? For me to see you. The words settled somewhere deep in my chest. Caleb stood. He didn't move toward the door. Instead, he came around the table and stopped a few feet away. Every other time I came inside, I had an excuse. Ollie. A water bottle. A crooked shelf. That mixer. You were very concerned about that shelf. It was terrible. It had character. It was a structural insult. I smiled. Caleb didn't look away. Tonight I came because I wanted to see you. My smile disappeared. There was nothing frightening in the moment. Only the vulnerability of being completely understood. I stepped closer. Then I'm glad you came. Caleb searched my face as if giving me every opportunity to change my mind. Can I kiss you? The question was so gentle that my answer came without hesitation. Yes. He leaned closer and kissed me softly. It was brief, careful, almost uncertain. But when he pulled back, something in his face had changed. Not grief disappearing. Not the past being replaced. Just fear loosening its grip. Caleb rested his forehead lightly against mine, and let out a breath that sounded as though he'd been holding it for years. "I thought this would feel wrong," he whispered. "Does it?" He considered the question. Then he smiled. "No." We stood there for another moment before I stepped back and reached behind the counter. "Wait." I took one chocolate chip cookie from the cooling tray, placed it in a paper bag, and handed it to him. Caleb stared at it, amused. "For later?" "Absolutely not. You finally admitted you like them." He opened the bag and took a bite before reaching the door. Outside, the rain had softened to a mist. Caleb turned back toward me, one hand resting on the doorframe. Months earlier, that doorway had been a boundary he couldn't cross. Now he stood there smiling, holding a half-eaten cookie. "Saturday?" he asked. 9/7. Ollie will insist. "And you?" Caleb looked at me with a calmness I'd never seen before. "I'll be here because I want to be." 1 year later, Ollie still arrived at Maple and Rye at 9:07 every Saturday morning. These days, he usually came through the door carrying a soccer ball, a library book, or some mysterious school project he expected me to understand immediately. That particular Saturday, he marched straight to the counter and announced, "2 chocolate chip cookies, please." I looked up from the tray of cinnamon rolls I just pulled from the oven. "Still 2. Obviously. You know, most customers eventually try something different." Ollie considered the pastry case. "I tried the oatmeal one. Once. It had raisins." He said the word as if I'd personally betrayed him. From the espresso machine behind me came a familiar voice. "I warned you not to challenge him about raisins." Caleb set a mug of black coffee on the counter and reached for another cup. He'd been helping me open the bakery on Saturday mornings for almost 6 months. Although helping was a generous description. He made excellent coffee, rearranged things without permission, and had somehow convinced himself that being an architect gave him authority over every shelf in the building. "Your job is coffee," I reminded him. "My job is preventing structural disasters. The shelves are fine. They're fine because I fixed them." Ollie sighed. "You two have this argument every week." "Tradition matters," Caleb said. That word once would have carried a different weight in this room. Now it made him smile. I placed 2 cookies on a plate and pushed them toward Ollie. He immediately took one and slid the other toward his father. Caleb accepted it without pretending he didn't want it. That small gesture still caught me sometimes. I remembered the 17 folded paper bags from those first 17 Saturdays. 17 cookies carried across 30 feet of pavement to a man who couldn't enter the place where his memories lived. Now Caleb sat inside the bakery, drinking coffee while his son covered the table with homework. Life hadn't changed through one enormous moment. It had changed through hundreds of ordinary ones. Sunday dinners became normal. Caleb learned that I hated assembling furniture despite owning approximately 20 pieces of furniture that required assembly. I learned that he sang badly while driving and refused to admit it. Ollie learned that having 2 adults around meant twice as many people could remind him to finish his vegetables. Margaret came by often enough that customers began assuming she worked there. And Claire remained part of everything. That had surprised Caleb most. There had never been a moment when loving me required him to stop loving the life he'd had before me. On the wall beside the window booth hung a photograph of Claire and Ollie taken years earlier. Claire was laughing at something outside the frame, while a much smaller Ollie held a cinnamon roll with both hands. Caleb had brought the photograph one morning and stood in front of that wall for nearly 10 minutes before asking me if we could hang it there. I'd handed him a hammer. Beside it now hung another photograph, taken at the county fair that summer. Caleb stood in the middle, Ollie on one side and me on the other, all 3 of us squinting into the afternoon sun. The photographs didn't compete. One didn't erase the other. Together, they told the truth. "Noah." Ollie's voice pulled me back. "You're staring again. I own the walls. I'm allowed to stare at them." Caleb followed my gaze toward the photographs. His expression softened. A year earlier, I might have looked away to give him privacy with whatever memory had found him. Now I understood that I didn't need to disappear whenever Claire entered the room through a story or a photograph. Caleb reached across the counter and took my hand. "You okay?" I asked. He nodded. "More than okay." The morning rush began around 10. Families filled the tables. The espresso machine hissed constantly. The bakery became its familiar mixture of voices, warm bread, cinnamon, and coffee. Ollie eventually moved to the window booth with his math homework. Caleb helped me carry a tray from the kitchen, then stole half a blueberry muffin while insisting that quality control was an essential responsibility. By noon, sunlight had filled the front windows. I looked toward the booth and saw Ollie concentrating on a worksheet, one sneaker swinging beneath the table. Above him were the two photographs. Beside me, Caleb was laughing because I'd discovered the missing half of my muffin. There had been a time when I thought healing meant reaching some invisible finish line where the past stopped hurting. Caleb taught me something different. Some losses stayed with us because some love stayed with us. Healing wasn't forgetting. It was discovering that memory and hope could sit at the same table. Caleb leaned against the counter beside me. "What are you thinking about?" "Cookies." He looked suspicious. "That sounds unlikely." "One cookie, actually. The second one." Ollie overheard us from across the room. "Dad's cookie." "Exactly." Caleb smiled and looked toward the front window. His black SUV was parked beneath the same maple tree where he used to wait every Saturday. The distance from that parking space to our front door had never changed. 30 feet, maybe a little less. But I knew now that some distances were measured differently. In fear, in memory, in the courage required to believe happiness was still allowed. The bell above the door rang as another family entered. Caleb squeezed my hand before returning to the coffee machine. Ollie took another bite of his cookie. Outside, the maple leaves moved gently in the sunlight. Inside, the second cookie was finally where it had always belonged.